You always end up with more.
This one's on attendance tonight.
Yes,
There you are.
yes,
We missed you last.
goodness.
For me? Yeah.
Yeah.
6:30. I was at the city council budget. workshop. That's what I'm supposed to. Yeah, she left. I did. And I came over and I was wondering if I was missed.
Yes.
Glad
It
to
was eerie. It
know
was
that.
eerie. It was an eerie absence. The void was groaning under the weight of your absence.
Well, and did my homework. I read the minutes.
Well, we're here this time. That's what matters.
Wait for Matt to show up. I don't know where Matt is. Oh, is Matt here? I didn't notice.
I decided to come one time today.
Well, was-
I was introduced
Yeah, right.
3 minutes ago.
Buddy, we are going to call to order the April 27th meeting of the Lexington Planning Commission. First item will be the approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And now we are going to move to approval of the minutes from the April 13th meeting.
I'd like to commend Kate on capturing a very robust meeting in the minutes.
And the fulsome discussion, I particularly enjoyed seeing the word fulsome in the minutes. You don't get that often. So we are, we
I
really got top of the line minutes going on. Thank you.
I noticed that I'm opined 3 times in here and I
You,
promise.
you
that-
opined a lot.
That will not happen. I won't promise it won't happen again, but I will do my best to limit it. And that's a way of saying I apologize to everybody. I could have said it in less words than I did. So
Not at all, not a problem at all over here.
So I move to approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Excellent. Moving on to citizens' comments on matters not on the agenda. Okay. It doesn't look like anybody will be speaking at this section, so we're going to move to our only item of new business, which is continuing discussion of zoning ordinance amendment 2023-01, accessory dwelling units. Arnie, why don't you lead us into what we would like to go over today?
If we could make a little bit of progress towards the remaining items, short-term rentals, separate sale of ADUs, owner occupancy and residency standards, and utility connections and other standards. So just as far as we can make it this evening. The first one, and I'm starting on page 15 with the nice big red arrow that starts with short-term rentals. But it occurred to me in reviewing this earlier today that it may help, and it's your discretion, if it would help to actually talk about the owner occupancy portion before we got into the short-term rental.
Mhm.
Or we just get into the short-term rental, and if we realize that we need to have any sort of decisions made on occupancy, maybe then we just come back.
Yeah, explain what you mean is because most likely the owner will not occupy that rental, that accessory dwelling unit.
We currently have a requirement, as you all know, for short-term rentals. I presume we would continue with that, where a primary, in the residential zoning districts, where a primary resident has to be on property for those short-term rentals, at least for 104 nights type A type rentals. And here we're getting into short-term rentals prior to actually on page 16, talking about owner occupancy standards. And so I'm just wondering if it would be helpful maybe to decide whether or not owners should be on the property for an accessory dwelling unit that's detached before we talk about short-term rentals or not.
Sure. And when you say that, I assume on the property means in either of the, okay.
To be determined, correct?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's
Yeah.
start there.
So we'll go over to number 14, which is on page 16, owner occupancy and residency standards. Just as an example, I'm going to read through a couple of these just to get it started. Bedford says only one accessory apartment shall be allowed on any one lot or parcel, and the owner of the property shall reside on the premises. So again, the question is, do we want the owner of the property to be in either one of the two units? One of these, I believe, even says in the main unit only, and then they sort of contradict themselves a little bit. I'm going to pull from Charlottesville's example, where one of the two dwelling units on the subject property must be occupied by the owner of the property, and notwithstanding any other residential occupancy provisions set forth within the zoning ordinance, no accessory apartment may be occupied by more than two persons. Now, we also in our definition section earlier haven't quite determined how many, but there's a placeholder there for accessory apartment should have no more than presumably two or three. We've seen those two numbers probably most often in some of these other codes that we're pulling from. So is there any particular feeling on whether the resident, the owner of the property should be required to, or perhaps B, that there not be that requirement?
I think that they should be required to be on the property. I think that the owner should reside in one of the units. I don't think it matters which one.
I would agree with that.
I would as well, and sort of with the rationale of what we talked with short-term rentals is somebody needs to be there to be held accountable because you have now two properties on there, but they're not independent properties. So I would agree.
I'm concerned. I agree with that. I'm concerned that the owner be allowed to live in the accessory dwelling, because presumably you could run into a situation in where the original house, the main house, actually can be divided up into several different spaces that can be occupied, rented to a number of different people at one time. So
Don't we have a requirement that there's only one ADU?
Currently, yes, on the parcel. So I'm curious if you had the accessory dwelling unit in a detached structure, and you're alluding to the front being broken up even further,
yeah,
potentially.
that's why I'm wondering if that could happen. And if we want to be careful about allowing that to happen, because I don't believe that's the intent of what we're trying to accomplish.
I would think the only thing you could have is however many people we determine can be in the accessory dwelling unit. So you could maybe have three, depending what we come up with, and I think we have a blank there, you could have three unrelated people living in the ADU part, but you could either way, whether it's the big building or the smaller building. So I don't see that it matters which one that the property owner lives in. Does that make sense?
Right, but you're concerned that if the owner of the property is in the external unit and that somebody else is renting the house, that the owner could actually break up the house and have more than one
Oh,
rental unit in
Like
the
rent-
house,
like-
but I think that's
Like
prohibited.
a normal rental, like
Yeah.
Right.
college students or law students or somebody like you. Is that, I mean,
Can that happen?
is that it? Long-term rentals are allowed in residential areas, right?
Correct.
Whether even notwithstanding anything about accessory dwelling units. What's the rule about unrelated people in one single house?
Most
Three.
of our residential zoning districts, there's a maximum of three unrelated. It's either a family or three unrelated. And that in our commercial districts, we go up to four unrelated people for residential units in commercial districts. But
So
to get
is-
to the question maybe about, the only instance that I can think of is in the R1 zoning district, if you have a duplex on a parcel, can you then have an accessory dwelling unit on the back of it if this goes forward? So that's the only case that I can think of other than a nonconformity, which I think right now for nonconform, if you're over the number of units that's allowed on the property currently, then it's non-conforming with respect to number of units. And I believe we've written in here already that you cannot have an extra unit. You cannot have an accessory dwelling unit if you're a non-conforming with respect to the number of units. So the only one I can think of again is R1 that allows a two-family dwelling. Would we want an extra accessory dwelling unit for either of those or for neither?
Couldn't they both be owned by different people
No, because of the way
in a,
we have
in a
it written
duplex?
is the duplex is actually on one parcel. Now, it is true that the zoning ordinance does not regulate ownership. So somebody that owns a duplex could in theory split the duplex into a condominium. And then you have common open space and then shared space, as well as each person owning their portion of the footprint of the building.
And back to Matt's original question, could you actually split a house into condominium units, like by floor?
You could, where the district allows you that number of units. Presumably that would only be in RM, residential multifamily, and also perhaps in residential like commercial.
But
Does
that's
that
an
answer-
interior, sorry, and wouldn't that then now be a definition of an interior accessory dwelling unit if you're subdividing one?
Is that true for condos? For condominiums?
Condos is an ownership
Right,
construct. It's not a number of units.
okay.
It's not a dwelling unit construct. So
So Matt, does that answer your question?
The concern is there is no way to play a game and to manipulate the occupancy rules in terms of making yourself an apartment where otherwise it wouldn't have been one would not have been allowed by just moving into the accessory dwelling unit and then by letting a couple of people move into the house.
I think it would be helpful for folks to be able to, as they perhaps age and want to live in the smaller unit, to allow that flexibility. But hope perhaps for this exercise, we also need to put perhaps a chart together to figure out how many units, short-term, long-term, R1 versus R2, so that we are somewhat sure that nobody can game the system, if you will, by adding the accessory and then splitting an R1 parcel into two equally sized so that it would meet the definition of a duplex. And then also the ownership portion of this that we're talking about, I think helps control that too, as opposed to somebody that's an investor type. Not that there's anything wrong with investor types that are coming in, putting in extra units when we need extra units. It's partially why we're doing this. But if there's that ownership, local control, then perhaps you won't have as much of that gaming of the system being attempted.
And can you just confirm that? So if let's say we had an accessory dwelling unit and we wanted to, and we rented it out, we would have to be in ownership, in residence for 180 some days per year. Is that correct?
We haven't determined exactly how, but if we follow the short-term rental rules and regulations, just that idea that the primary resident has to be there 185 days out of the year, then we could certainly follow that.
And then could I also, in addition to renting out the ADU, could I also do my house as an Airbnb?
That's going to be when we go back to the short-term
Okay.
rental portion to discuss exactly
Because I think we
that.
don't want that to happen.
That's why I wanted to perhaps nail down what our preference is for ownership and residency requirements, and then maybe deal with the short-term rental portion of that.
Yeah. Of the samples we have here, reading them this afternoon, I found Bedford County to be one of the simplest. And then rereading the sample from Strasbourg, it offers the flexibility of the owner occupant either being in the accessory unit or the main dwelling. And I'm not quite sure of the wording there, but
Yeah, it looks like they're two contradicting
But
statements.
some of them, I think, are mixing the definitions in here when you read them. So I'm assuming the focus, the reason you brought us here, Arnie, is that we're really looking at the definition and of the owner occupancy. Because some of the others talk about the size of the family, unrelated persons, and that's not what we're talking about here. But Strasbourg, accessory dwelling is allowed incidental to the primary dwelling unit on the same lot as the primary unit, subject to the following. The primary dwelling unit is owner occupied, and then there's something missing. The owner of the principal building or lot shall be the occupant of the principal dwelling or the accessory unit at all times.
I went back and looked at that, and it does seem to be a contradiction in
Yeah.
their own code. So I didn't call them up
Oh.
and ask them why they had a contradiction.
It was their I feel like we all agree that one of the two dwellings, whether it's the primary or the accessory, should be owner occupied. We should start with that foundation.
Mhm.
We all agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with John. I don't think we need to define family units or the unrelated persons in this section.
Mhm.
So we should just not focus on that. And then now it's just, do we feel strongly about the person has to be residing in the primary dwelling, or can they be in either? And yeah, I could see situations where it would be fine for an owner to be in the accessory dwelling. So so I feel like we're pretty close.
So one thing that occurs to me, so there's this question of utilities, like they can't be on separate utilities. And is there any concern about having the primary or the owner in an accessory unit that would not be located where the main utility, say meters and things like that are? Is that an issue, a concern? I don't know.
I'm not sure I'm following you. That it's not convenient and therefore it's expensive to do, or it's just not available to the rear.
I don't know. It just seems like an owner should be in control of the utilities
And
and, like the electrical outlet. I mean,
once we get to that, I think there will be a recommendation that they're all on the same utilities, that they're not separately metered. And that also helps with expense, because if you require them to be separately metered, then putting in the ADU becomes that much more expensive. And that's one of the things that
Sure.
the AARP
Yeah.
recommended
but
against.
that's my point
specifically.
though, is that if they're on the same meters and the same electrical and everything. So is there any issue with having the owner not in the building where the main breaker is, for example? Does that matter?
I don't think so. And because they're still going to get somebody, it actually may not matter if it's the owner who gets the bill or is in charge or has access to the main breakers, or if the tenant does, if they're in the main house, and presumably that's where the services enter the building and are metered, and where the junction box is and all that. So I cannot think of an instance where that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. It's just, and luckily we're again having not a property manager, but a property owner involved in control over the property.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. I don't think that we should limit the owner to living in the primary structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do we need to redefine only one accessory apartment shall be allowed on any one parcel? Like the Bedford County example has two clauses. Or no, it just says at the first part just says, seems to be repeating the definition of, so, but should we say it as simply and as shortly as shall reside on premises, or should we have more of like the second part of E where it says the owner of the principal building or lot shall be the occupant of the principal dwelling or of the accessory dwelling unit at all times?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more clear.
But what does at all times mean? Is it 185 days? Does that qualify as at all times? Because
I guess that means that you can't.
No, I would say at all times, it has to be your permanent residence. It's not like short-term rental where you have to live there most of the year. You have to be there.
And there are other mechanisms from reading some of the other codes that You could force or require a property owner to put in or to, sorry, do a deed restriction that if they're going to have an accessory dwelling unit, then they're going to be they're going to be the owner and a resident of one of the units. And that's going to hurt them a little bit apparently when they go for financing, if they need to refinance or pay for the accessory dwelling unit. But there are instances where jurisdictions require there to be a deed restriction, if you will. I don't know exactly how that happens. I can imagine we can draft something up. That's one way of controlling. Another way is to have them annually register with us, maybe at no cost, or it's conditional use permit. Maybe we require there to be an annual inspection, but to sort of, as best we can, control that the primary or that the owner is on the property in either the primary unit or in the accessory. So there are some other tools if you need them. I'm not saying that it's necessarily recommended, but once you sort of determine that the owner has to be in one of the units and there's not going to be a requirement, which one, how much further do you want to go about requirements for proving that they are going to stay on the property, and to what effort I guess staff would have to go towards that.
Yeah, and it kind of brings up an interesting point. If somebody decides they no want to longer use it as a accessory dwelling unit, I mean, do you put a little caveat saying as long as it's used as an accessory dwelling unit? Because if it's not, then you could split your time between two places.
And we're going to have a little bit of flexibility because right now it's conditional use permits. So in the conditional use permit, we have the ability to put in conditions to deal with some of this. But then do we just put in something that and report immediately to staff if you no longer intend to utilize it for an accessory, and then that frees them up to have a little bit more flexibility.
So maybe registering with the office on an annual basis would make sense. And
That's
that
something that we can think
I'm-
about, certainly.
having the language, saying that you have to be there all the time
Right.
seems very restrictive to me. But I mean, I know that people go on vacation and stuff.
I guess you could call it your primary residence, and then you do kind of get to that 185. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not uncommon for people to have two homes, and
Right.
you're here in the summer or you're here in the winter and you live somewhere else 9 months of the year.
But 9 months of the year, then they would not be able to do this
So
arrangement.
if this is your vacation, your summer home, you would not be able to legally have an accessory dwelling unit. That's what we're saying.
You just put a period at the end of accessory unit and not say at all times. I mean,
Yeah.
if that's the definitional issue. To me, I'm okay with it because it just assumes that is my full-time residence. I might be gone for 6 months traveling, but it is my residence. But if that's causing confusion, then you can take that 3 words out.
At what point, so someone, in R1 can rent their house to somebody for a half a year, right? Or a year, right?
They're on sabbatical.
On sabbatical,
yeah.
People who get that sort of thing, and you can rent your house. You could do that. And that's all right, right? Now, so if you've got an accessory detached dwelling unit, you're living in the detached place, and you got someone else living in the other one, you're like, are you renting that to them? Right?
Uh-huh.
And then if you decide, well, I'm going on sabbatical, you're just renting your house. You're like, I mean, how's that different? Why do we, what's that?
Then you would have 2 rentals, right? Is that what you're getting?
No. Well, I mean, if I just leave it empty, if I ditch
Yeah.
my little, cottage there in the back of my yard that I've been living in, and I'm still just renting my big house, the big house, whatever, the main dwelling. So how's that different? Right? I mean, I could see not renting out both, not like take it off and say I'm renting both, and you just have 2 rental properties on the same. I could see that as a problem.
Which is really what we're trying to prevent. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Is that situation?
So That's just, does that make sense what I'm,
Yeah.
It
so
does.
Like, what's the difference between just renting a house and
yeah,
not living in the
yeah,
accessory?
if I just, if I get just, I'm like, well, I don't have to rent this accessory dwelling unit. It's paid for. I don't need to rent it to recoup I'm going somewhere else.
But I think we do want to ensure that one of them is your, I guess.
Yeah, if it's your
instead of
primary
just
residence.
Primary, yeah, saying
Yeah.
primary rather than like you were saying
Yeah.
all the time.
I mean, it's my primary residence, but I'm going to Spain for a year or something.
You're not allowed to now. You have to be there 185 days.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I mean,
But again, I'm not so sure it's a problem unless you try to rent out the unit
Yeah,
that you're
right.
vacating.
right. I'm saying, right. If I,
Right.
So, yeah.
But we,
Yeah, right.
we currently, there's no way to police to monitor that.
There's, it's
enforce it.
very difficult to,
yeah.
the occupancy portion is very difficult to monitor,
Yeah,
yes.
but you just can't have the person, if you take off, you just can't have the other people renting theirs out as an Airbnb, right? Then they can't do that. That's completely against what we're looking at, right?
Or more like renting yours out.
Or renting or renting the other one.
I think that's the
Right.
main
Because
we're worried
if the
about.
primary owner of the whole property, both is away, then you can't be renting it as,
Right. I think that's what we're trying to prevent.
And if that happens, then they would be under threat of losing their conditional use permit.
so this at all times is, I think, the problem here, right? I mean, it's got to be
Right.
one of the two has to be the primary dwelling of the owner, whether they're actually there, they can be away.
So then are we looking at the Strasbourg, the last sentence in the Strasbourg example, the owner of the principal building or lot shall be occupant of the principal dwelling or of the accessory dwelling unit, period?
Hmm.
With that,
Yeah.
At all times.
Yeah.
I
right.
would.
Yes, that was my previous suggestion, not my opinion.
Anything else on occupancy?
Do we need more than that, or is that enough? Because whether there's only one accessory apartment that is taken care of elsewhere?
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
Then once we paste this together, after we've made a number of decisions, we'll get rid of those instances where we have overlapping language.
So when we say conditional use permit, you have to remind me, when somebody comes forward for conditional use permit, there are certain things that they will proffer to us, or is this part of the established now conditional use permit? Or, I mean,
During a conditional use permit, they can offer conditions. And I presume that once we draft this up, if it's going to be a conditional use permit, we'll probably have standards. We're going to be developing standards anyway. So we'll have probably a number of standards that go forward that they're going to have to meet anyway. If they want.
that's what I want, yeah.
So we can place conditions on a conditional use permit, and they can also offer conditions above and beyond what we would be requiring, if that's the question. We're not limited by proffers, which is zoning, which is completely different, and we're not in a ministerial aspect. So there is discretion.
Yeah, I just didn't know if it was legal for us at that point to offer. To say this is a condition, in addition to what you're offering.
They can offer and we can impose and
So we can-
for
that's
conditions.
what- we can-
That's it
Yeah,
for
let's,
section 14. I think we're going to bounce back to 12 to talk about short-term rentals. I have a couple of examples there. Maybe just to quickly go over what we have currently for short-term rentals. In the residential zoning districts, you have to be a primary resident, and it says that the burden of proof is on the property owner when they come in for a registration. So when they're applying for a short-term rental, it's their burden of proof to prove that they are the primary resident. And the things that we accept, because there's really nothing foolproof. Your taxes maybe, but people cheat on their taxes. Not looking at anyone in particular. But the things that we request from folks, your driver's license copy, your vehicle registration, your voter registration, tax forms, where you bank is a pretty good indication of where you live as a primary resident. So those are types of things that we typically ask for. I'm not saying that we have to do all those necessarily for accessory dwelling units, but just to give you a rundown of how we currently operate a short-term rental application. Again, that's a by right process as long as and staff administered. There are type A and type B. So in the type A situation, 104 nights total. You can rent out up to 2 rooms, 2 adults maximum per room. And you can do that again, 104 nights. A subset of that, you can actually leave and rent out all the rooms at your house and do that for 45 nights. So that's just a quick rundown of short-term rental as far as the way we currently operate that.
So you can
And it's
rent
annual
out,
registration.
how many rooms can you rent out?
Up to 2 rooms in the type A. The type A is more the Airbnb where you're there 104 nights and you can rent out to up to 2 rooms at a time.
For the other 200 and,
No, that's 104 nights total that you can rent out. And then as a subset of
and do you have to be
you
there?
have to be there. But we gave some flexibility because we utilize this hybrid approach that I think was in Blacksburg at the time as well. Where again, Airbnb, you're there, you rent out a room or 2 rooms. VRBO, you rent out the whole house and you're not there. And because we have big weekends around here, it was determined that maybe we should allow some flexibility. And so 104 nights is your total number of nights that you can rent short term. But out of that 104 nights, 45 nights is a subset of that. And you can actually rent out 45 nights and not be there at all and rent all your bedrooms. More the VRBO style.
So then what we're looking at is whether we would want to allow short-term rentals if there is an ADU that is being occupied.
Mhm.
In either the ADU or the main dwelling. And then to make it a little bit more complicated, we allowed in our short-term rentals that if you're not even the owner, if you have a lease, because sometimes, if you're going to lease a property for a year, you have control over it. So we figured that was sufficient for control over the property, that a person who has a lease at least a year in length, they could also do short-term rental. So the question
The
may
people
be,
who are renting can do short-term rental. So
Correct.
they can sublet.
correct, on a short-term basis, yes.
How?
So how many short-term rentals do you want on a property that has a main residence and then an accessory?
Wow.
So the Lynchburg example we have here tries to answer the question that question, Arnie, that as long as the primary residence is owner occupied. Or the same with Roanoke, allows 1 home stay per parcel and the owner must reside on the property, so they're the same.
Yeah, and then the staff one too.
I would say
agrees with that.
Staff
The Roanoke one
recommends
is,
1 short-term rental to be allowed. What is the home is required of the homestay permit? Is that just another
it's another
same
term. and-
short-term rental?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
I would just point out a slight distinction in Lynchburg, as long as the primary dwelling is owner occupied. So they're limiting
Mhm.
Right.
the owner to only the main dwelling, or that I don't read that into the Roanoke. As long as they reside on the property.
Mhm.
So would you like to allow short-term rentals in both, in one, or not at all, considering we're already giving the allowance of a second unit on the property?
I know the only hesitation, my only hesitation to allowing it for either unit, 1 per property, is if you stop And I guess it's really only an issue maybe if you're an RLC where you have lots of flexibility on a short-term rental. So then you build a ADU in your backyard and you use it as a short-term rental full-time because there's no
Owner.
date limits.
True.
Yeah, right. So so it could be a full-time rental, but you can do that with the main house. So maybe it's not really a problem.
But if you have a house in RLC where you could do short-term rental in the main and in the accessory. Is that where you're also
Well, I think
going
as
or
long as
thinking?
we go with yours saying only one short-term rental per parcel,
Yeah.
that takes care of that situation.
Mhm.
To be honest, I was thinking more just in our R1 and R2, wasn't really thinking so as
Oh,
far as
yeah, right.
RLC, where there's a lot more flexibility, no owner occupancy requirements, no limitation on the number of nights rented. So that is important to keep in consideration. Also,
Yeah.
those other zoning districts where it's a little bit more open for short-term rental.
I think just on one or the other,
Yeah.
because I think if it'll bring too many, it could potentially bring too many people, like on the big weekends where people want to rent and you got a whole house and then you also have another house and next thing you know, you got 4 or 5 cars. And so
Right.
I think just the one or the other. And
So only one short-term rental
Mhm.
allowed per.
property per whatever that
Parcel.
parcel.
And then does it matter whether it's the owner or the renter in the ADU or sorry, the terminology, the owner who is occupying one or the other and the normal occupant of the other unit, whether it's the ADU or the main house, can either of those in that Pat and that
Yeah, I guess if they're a long-term renter, right, like you had said.
so
and
either one,
yeah.
but then they have to coordinate because
Yeah,
they
right,
couldn't they couldn't
Right.
both.
right.
So you have to
And
get a permit to be a short-term rental, some kind of
Registration.
yes, you can.
process.
And then
Hmm.
it might be a case where the accessory dwelling unit, well, that isn't actually rented, could just be family, right? So you don't have to rent one or the other, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if right, you could have your kids living in the bigger house and you're the grandparent, you want to downsize on your own property, you're living in a smaller place, you're not renting it to your kids, you don't have to, right? You can just let them live there. It's basically all like one household. So it would still be the same. You're renting out one or the other.
Yeah, I think where we're really distinguishing is the unrelated.
Yeah.
That's, and if everybody's related, then you have a lot of room in this.
Mhm. Yeah, and just not setting up a situation where we have a commercial venture going on,
Mhm.
but I think we have so many limits in our short-term rental rules that I think we're okay.
This will also make a little bit more sense when you see it all together.
Yeah,
Because right
right,
now we're
right.
piecing and parsing it. So if it'll just be easier once it's all in one form.
So what's the final recommendation?
It sounds like
It's like,
Is that the Roanoke example?
what's the simplest?
I think F is the.
Yeah.
I think F just is the
Yeah.
simplest.
And we don't have to cover that the owner must reside on the property because we've already covered
We
that
already covered
elsewhere.
all that in the residence requirements and
and in the
Yeah.
short-term
the
rental.
short-term rental rules. Yeah. All right, so
Sounds good.
All righty, if we're good there, then separate sale of ADUs. It's just one of the items that we're following in this guide and it's gonna make it really difficult. So I would at least recommend that be prohibited or not allowed.
I think we
I
already
agree.
decided to, right, in another meeting.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's good.
Everybody generally agree there.
Yes.
Okay.
Blake and Arnie, you're moving us along. This is good.
15, I guess it's fairly self-explanatory in that accessory dwelling units shall not be included in calculations of density. It's not really as important here, in my opinion, because we don't have density requirements calculations per se. We're not going to create 100-unit subdivision or 100-acre subdivision, then we're limited by however many units per acre. And then we would really have to distinguish between whether or not the accessory counts towards. But I think in this case, it's easy enough to say the accessory dwelling shall not be included in calculations of density, even though we probably won't be coming up against that in any case that I can think of. Does that make sense just as far as how we handle density? And that will at least make it clear if somebody asks, well, if we have generally so many units allowed or already allowed in a subdivision, let's say if Weatherburn hadn't been finalized, then somebody might come in and ask, hey, can I add this one? And then we have to figure out, in addition to the lot requirements and all the other things, whether or not this would be included or not included in a density calculation.
So is it better just to omit that completely? Like the number of unrelated people, that's not considered density.
And we already have that unrelated people
Right.
in the front section of the zoning ordinance. So that's why it wasn't important to bring that forward here. We can sort of ponder that perhaps and see if it's necessary to
Yeah.
include or not include.
Yeah, I'm just, just thinking of cases where someone may. But if we're only saying one per unit, one per parcel accessory, that's a limit in itself. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have the case where someone's going to be developing a subdivision where they sell it on the basis that, guess what? You can add an accessory unit in your backyard in 10 years' time. I don't think we are there yet. So
And certainly not now with it being conditional, at least at this time. So that would make it that much more difficult. All right, so we'll just put a question mark perhaps by that one for the moment. Utility connections, we got in that a little bit a moment ago. Generally, it was recommended, at least in AARP guide, that we do not require that they be on separate because that makes the connections so much more expensive. Then also, if you separate them, then perhaps the property owner doesn't have as much control over it. And then you're really talking about more about two separate units as opposed to a primary and an accessory. Now you've got two sort of independent things. So at least staff would recommend that there not be a requirement that they are separately hooked up to utilities.
And can we add that word? It is not required for them to be separate because the Roanoke doesn't read like that.
Are you okay with allowing it if the property owner so chooses?
Yeah, why would we not?
Again, I think it's just maybe looking at it in the sense that if you have two separate utilities coming to the property, it may be easier to meter, it may be easier for the billing and all that. But then are we really having a primary with a secondary, or are we just having two separate units completely that may not function? I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but and I'm not sure that there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but do we want to make that distinction? I can see certainly not requiring it, but do you want?
Does the number of utility connections have any factor or calculation in what statistics cities use for housing
For number of households, it
for number of
does.
households, for emergency services, I'm just curious, like,
That would be
Good
dwelling
question.
units and addresses and not necessarily utility connections, though.
that's what I'm questioning is like, does the actual utility connections matter for any calculations for services or is it not? And that's not
I can't think of any.
metric. That metric's not really used.
Can't think of any census data that's based that I can
Taxing-
think of
tax
immediately.
information. It's not
Yeah.
based on utility connections. It's based on,
Yeah, not a required, but we have used it to kind of give an estimate of number of households, but not something that's required.
Do we currently have an internal accessory dwelling unit that's internal to the main building with separate?
And there's no way to tell. In other words, I certainly haven't gone through any kind of utility data to determine that. And I'm not sure if we would have that we could parse that out necessarily.
Right, because like
So
your house.
I
used
don't
to-
know.
Used to have several meters.
I don't know if it had several meters, but it has several boxes.
Yeah, I recall it being a couple meters outside.
Okay,
I think so. I mean, it's, 'cause I think the upstairs used to be rented out.
that sounds
In the
right.
ye old
I know
days.
that there are other places in town that, the
Yeah,
houses
yeah.
in town that were like that.
The house beside me that I showed the picture of previously about the stairwell and the exterior access, they have 4 meter bases. I think only 2 or 3 of those are utilized now, but that building was split up and it's not that big into 4 different metered sections at
Right.
some point.
Because if someone might, like Leslie was saying, might. Yeah, otherwise, you're kind of guesstimating how much
Mhm.
Mhm.
the others are using. You might want to say, I'm not, I don't want to mess with that. I want them to just pay exactly what they're
Mhm.
using. So allowing it, I don't know what problems we're going to run into, right?
Right.
That's what you're saying, right, Leslie? I don't-
Right.
Yeah.
Sounds like not a requirement.
Not a
but it's
requirement.
Okay to allow it
Yeah.
if the
Right.
property owner chooses to.
Yeah, pay the extra, whatever the extra is to do that. And that's up on them, right? And
Some-
utility companies do it.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Pat. That
Yep.
it makes sense to allow it if the homeowner chooses. Otherwise, you could get into a very uncomfortable situation.
Yeah.
Where 6 people are living in the primary unit and the owner is living in the accessory.
He's
And
mining Bitcoin.
Right. That's true. They said that in fraternity houses. Or just water usage, there's no incentive to conserve water if you're not.
Right.
no,
Right.
paying a meter.
And is there any issue with from the utilities perspective, having just one account, but 2 physical mailing addresses or 911 addresses? Is that an issue at all?
I don't think so, because if you have one account, it's going to go to wherever the primary person is, if he's in the big house or the little house. I don't think that's an issue. Emergency services, because we've already required that there be a separate address, they're going to know where they're going. So I don't think there's going to be that issue.
We did say that there are separate addresses. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a requirement, if
Yes,
I
that's
remember
a
correctly, in
requirement.
their definition or earlier on.
For property tax reasons, since this is one parcel, it's not gonna change. But again, property tax reasons, financial, they don't use the utilities as the metric for number of. It's because it's still one parcel, we're assuming.
Mhm.
Correct, but it could, if you build something new, so now you've got more floor area, that's going to be something that drives the amount of improvements that you
Oh,
have.
yeah, sorry,
So
I guess I'm,
That,
right, no, I get that. I'm just trying to go back
Utilities.
to
Yeah.
make sure that they're not using utility connections as any sort of metric for
Yeah.
how the city charges for services.
not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think that what people have said is great, that it's not required, but it's allowed, but it's not required.
General consensus there.
yes,
Okay. I'm sorry, that's all we got. I have some notes there about non-conforming structures that I never got back to, so that's not really in usable form yet.
Um,
Can I ask a question about the purpose? Sorry to go take us back, page 11 in the,
Building codes,
Oh, did I miss one?
building
Yeah.
codes.
let's do that first.
Oh, sorry, yeah,
Which that looked good. Charlottesville looked good.
thank you. And that would be the recommended one, because the other one, I think Fakir started talking about a lesser building code, and I think that's problematic. To explain a little bit also, we have the building code for existing buildings. It's called the existing building code. It's not the building code that's current, but
new
it's the
building.
building code for new structures and the building code for existing structures. And there's a good bit of flexibility in the building code for existing structures. So if somebody has an accessory garage and they want to convert it, they can utilize that building code for existing structures. So just to make you aware that there is some flexibility there. That's not, if you had to build a brand new one, it's got to come to code. But in either case, I'm not sure why I went into that tangent, is that if you say it must comply with all applicable building codes, it'll have to apply to either the existing building code or the new construction code.
That sounds good.
So the Charlottesville.
Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Thank you for bringing me back to that. And sorry, your question was about
Page 11. I just was wondering if we actually need to have in the first sentence, if we need to have this, so it starts in Lexington, accessory dwellings are intended to provide additional housing options. Can we just end in the city? Could we just end it there? Do we really need for the benefit and convenience of families and households with changing economic conditions and or family structure? Because does that matter?
No, I think that was just helpful when we were starting out on this endeavor.
Yeah.
But we can certainly pare it back if it's deemed to be no longer needed. And if I remember correctly, we also had a lot more than that in there at one point.
Right.
It was also
decided not to utilize.
maybe purpose and intent.
Mhm.
But I agree. I don't.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go back and. Why don't we just do all like the culling all at once when we are ready to kind of summarize things?
So we'll take that as a note.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind making note of it, because I won't necessarily catch it next time. And I just caught it this time. It just seems sort of like we want to, there should be, there could be many reasons that people decide to do this, not just these two.
We also need to, another time, because I don't want to do it today, is figure out of all the sections we've covered already, how it changes for attached and detached, because we have two definitions and so like a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is for detached, but are any of these rules going to be slightly different if it's attached? So that's what I'm saying. We did have to tidy up the language because we are currently going down the path of having two separate definitions.
Perhaps that will be my task for the next time, is to provide you a little bit more on non-conforming structures, then also develop what we have done so far into an actual ordinance structure, so that we can then determine how much do we sort of keep together that applies to both, and then where does it split, where we have specific requirements for attached and detached.
How about we open up public comment for this item?
Blake, I just wanted, and Arnie, I just wanted to reference these before we ended our discussion.
Okay.
But
Let-
that can be done later.
Sure. Is there anybody who would like to speak for public comment? Yeah, okay. This is the time. Just state your name and your address, please.
My name is Mirabai McLeod. My address is 451 Lime Kiln Road. And some of you have heard the story before, some of you haven't. I live on Lime Kiln Road. I have a small house, and next to the house, there's a concrete block carport. For 11 years, the back of the carport has been my catering kitchen. I'm trying to retire and would like to extend the wall of the catering kitchen out farther and make it an accessory dwelling unit. I don't want to do short term. I don't want to do anybody else living in the house but myself. I want it one person. There's already off-street parking, already has air conditioning, heat, gas, and electric. And in answer to your question about if it's difficult to have two separate accounts for one mailing address, they just differentiate it for me, home and shop. It's the same account.
Perfect.
But I would love it if I could have separate meters, because I don't want to worry about, like you said, if they use a ton of water or whatever, keep that clean. So I also want to say, I see how much work this is, and I really appreciate how much y'all are doing, because it's a lot of little issues. And I'm going to throw another one on the table here.
Mhm.
So what's the issue for me now is looking at size. So the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the size of the ADU can only be 40% of the main dwelling. So that to me is a punishment to me as a single person who lives in a small, simple, energy efficient little house. My house is less than 1,000 square feet. My house is 896 square feet. And to me, that's a good thing, you know? So if we take 40% of that, that means my ADU can only be 395 square feet. My house is 900 and some, and it's a small house. 300 and some square feet is a very, very small space. If I'm allowed to bring, so it's already an existing unit. I don't have to build anything. It's already there. All I need to do is put a front wall on. If I do that for the entire space of the concrete walled carport, it comes to a total of 570 square feet. That's a reasonable amount for someone to live in. I think it would be very difficult for someone to live in the 395 square feet, especially because it has to have a kitchen, a bathroom, a closet, you know. If I'm going to rent it as a dwelling unit, that would be very difficult. But an option for me that I believe I'm not allowed to do is to keep the smaller space and rent it as a studio. And I was told I wasn't allowed to do that because a studio can only be in the downtown district, and I'm in a residential district. There's a big need, from what Washington and Lee Art Department tells me, there's a big need for studios as well. But I've been told that only someone who lives in my house can rent the studio, can use it as a studio or rent it as a studio. And again, please help me to understand if I'm not understanding this correctly. So I'm just asking for some help here, because this whole process really affects my retirement, the end of my life, the quality of the end of my life. And I'm happy if I can't make it into the 570 square feet. And I wonder if, because the space is already built, if that's grandfathered in, and I don't know how that works. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was gonna say, I think that we just segment definitions of studio and zoning another time. This is, so we want to hear what you have to say about the accessory dwelling unit.
So the
subject.
issue for me is that 40%. Yeah, I
Sure.
appreciate what you're saying.
Um,
So,
Okay.
so how do I deal with that? And I don't know how to do this.
Are we allowed to have conversation?
Sure.
So you said it's an attached
No, it's
garage? It's
detached.
detached
Right.
by
So
a
it's
lot?
Carport, it's 10 feet. Between 8 to 10 feet between my house and the carport. So like I said, it's a concrete block building.
Yeah.
In the back is the catering kitchen.
Yeah.
I'd like to move the wall.
I think
Yeah.
if I remember from our intent of that limitation, it was we don't want the detached or attached accessory to be larger than the principal dwelling. So we wanted to find a number that was smaller than 50%.
Right.
And then we were debating 800 feet versus 1,000 square feet. We ended on 800. I don't know. I guess you're right. In certain situations, 40% of a small single family home could be a very small space. So I don't know if people are amenable to having it say may not exceed 40% of the gross floor of the primary dwelling, or 800 feet, whichever is greater, something like that. That would be one
Well,
solution.
I mean, that would be the answer.
But
to
I
my
don't-
Personal problem.
Yeah, but I don't want to speak for other people,
Right.
so we'd have to discuss that.
Yeah, I think
Right.
once we close the
Yeah.
public.
And-
Okay, so anything else before we can have a little bit further discussion?
And I appreciate you at least looking at it
Mhm.
because it is an issue. And like I said, it just feels like I'm
Yeah.
being punished for having a small home
Mhm.
and I shouldn't.
Sure.
It-
No, that's, yeah,
a
it's good.
thing.
We want to hear from the public and we're hopefully, once we have more ink dry on the the rough draft is, we'll have even more people, more public will give feedback and we'll, things will definitely mold into
Yeah.
the right, yeah.
Thank
But it's
you.
good. Yeah, thanks for your feedback, Mirabai. Yeah, so we can just have more discussion on that right now. So while we're here, if you want, just,
You want to close public?
sure. Any other public comment? Okay, I'll close public comment and we'll jump back into quick discussion.
I think one of the things that brings up, and I still see garage apartments, and it's sort of a garage apartment, but it will no longer be used as a garage, it sounds like. I do see those a little bit differently than a new build. And I guess it gets more into maybe not so much garage apartment as this is an existing non-conforming structure being converted. And in that case, Arnie, other than setbacks, can we make other allowances, for existing non-conforming structures being turned into ADUs?
Was that for, did you say for setbacks
Well,
particularly?
I think
or-
right now we already have it for setbacks. Can we for size,
Oh, size.
right? Can we include it to make it to include more than just setbacks?
Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about it. You could certainly do it that way. We'd have to get in there and wordsmith it a little bit. You could also, if you wanted to, but this would be for all of them and not just for the ones that you're talking about for garages that are being converted that are already in existence. But you could easily just put a floor in of, 40%, no more than 750 square feet, but also no less than 500 square feet. But I don't think that's exactly what you're getting to because
Yeah,
you're
right.
giving more of allowance for something that exists.
Right.
So yes, we could find a place and
Okay.
potentially put that in as a concession, not a concession, an allowance.
Yeah, because I hesitate on changing the 40% in general, because I do think they should be not subsequent, smaller, subordinate, that's the word I'm sorry, I'm looking for. They should be subordinate to the primary structure. But for an existing structure, people are already used to seeing that existing structure. So I have no problem in that situation, allowing more leeway.
Although in this particular instance, she was talking about expanding.
Yeah.
The-
Yeah.
I
But
think
not, the structure, it just
Yeah.
expanding where the wall is. It just kind of has the part one up.
Yeah.
And in the front of it
initially
is kinda like a
sounded
garage now,
she
like
was
you could go-
expanding the structure, but right, then it was just
Okay.
adding. a
Yeah, the concrete slab and the walls in which it's sitting. Yeah, so it's basically it's the front of it is still a garage and the back is,
Okay.
so
Is
that's what.
If I remember correctly, if I remember
Okay.
correctly, we had in one of our other jurisdictions there, the 15%. So maybe this is it. Provided that any expansion or enlargement of such structure, and that such structure is one that's already existing, shall not exceed 15% of the floor area existing prior to the date that we start this. So you could put a percentage increase. In other words, if there's 500 and so I think the answer is yes, that you could allow structures that are existing that are non-conforming to have a certain percentage above or put it at a square foot requirement. So one of our other jurisdictions, I think it's Loudoun County, already has something similar to that, but we can craft something up for the next time to see if we can.
Okay.
When we're talking about non-conforming structures anyway, we can craft something.
So
I sort of like the idea of having a minimum size. Like we don't necessarily want an ADU that's 300 square feet that's supposed to have all of the things, that you need in a living space.
Would that be the simplest to just put in
Well.
Yeah.
I agree. We don't want. We still have definitions that there has to be kitchen, whatever, stove, right? Somewhere written here.
Full
When we
kitchen.
define,
Yes. Yep.
but. And then as long as it's sort of anchored to the
Mhm.
foundation correctly. And then uses the right building materials, like there's no harm in having a small
Yeah.
home, like
Yep,
small
yep,
homes
yep.
are,
You're right.
Right, having a tiny house.
some people are minimalist. I mean, I'm just saying, yeah, yeah, exactly. So I'm just saying, I don't think we need to have a floor require, I guess sort of the thought I still had was. Aside from like, okay, well, we'll just allow variance on this one specific case, like. Could we have, we want it to be subordinate, so just less than 50%, but we said 40%. But also sometimes that's too small, so. Or, either 40% or 800 feet, whichever one, or instead of. That, I don't know, instead of.
Yeah, I mean, in
I
rereading it today, it's, if we say 40%, but not more than 800, what if we did that partially because we were concerned about large houses?
Mhm.
Yeah,
That,
right.
that, and as opposed to dealing with what Mirabai has pointed out about a small one, but we have the cap of 800. So would it make any difference if it said 50%? But not more than 800? You see that
Right.
the 800 is the cap.
That's true.
Well, right, but if we're saying if it's 40% of 1,000, that's 400 square feet. If you have 1,000 square foot home, 40% is 400 square feet, and that we're saying that you can't even have a 600 square foot accessory dwelling, that's subordinate because it's.
Right, so if it was, I guess what I'm saying is if the percentage was increased,
Yes,
Right.
it
Yeah.
doesn't matter because we still have the cap of 800.
that's right. So you could have 60%.
Right,
You could have it could be, 60% up to 800 square feet, and 800 square feet is, as you say, already, it's pretty small.
The question is the proportion of how they look towards each other. That's what we were getting at with, at what point do they seem to be co-equal? That's the point of the percentage of the square foot.
Exactly.
And so I guess the question is, at what level can we say, can we tolerate that one is getting closer to the other? What's the limit as it approaches, and does that matter too much, especially when it's already two existing structures as we're talking about here?
So building footprint might be part of that conversation, so if you're looking at a 1,000 square foot house that's all on one floor, 800 square feet next to it would be not that subordinate. Whereas if you've got a 2-story, 3,000 square foot house and you've got an 800 square foot house next to it, it would look a lot smaller and be clearly subordinate. Even I don't know. It's
Now that I'm rereading the 3A and 3B,
That's what happens.
if it's detached, then you're not sharing the same gross floor plan. Like, if it's a completely separate unit, then it's not
Right.
part of the floor plan of,
Mhm.
it's not calculated in the floor plan. So, right, so like if you're saying I have like, it's not. If your home is like, let's just use a round number of 1,000 square feet. And you have an attached accessory dwelling unit that is, say, 400 square feet of that. So it's 400 square feet attached to 600 square feet of the primary. So that's right. That's what we're saying.
Mhm.
But then if that's detached, now the primary dwelling is only 600 square feet. And then the accessory dwelling would have to be 40% of 600 square feet. Sorry, I'm don't put this on the minute. I'm just trying to say, like, how do you calculate floor plan of a detached? Because that's not considered part of the square
Yeah.
footage of a finished house, right?
No, but I mean, in purport, like if your 1,000 square foot house is floor, then we're just saying, okay, it's 1,000 square feet. This one can be 600.
Yeah.
Can have a
So they-
600 square foot one.
Right.
This is 1,000 square feet and this one can be 600
Yeah,
60%.
right.
or 400 square feet, maybe 40%, right? Yeah. So I mean, it's not of that. It's just if this one's 1,000 square feet, this one gets to be 400 square feet. It's just a way of limiting the size of this. As opposed to the one that's inside.
Okay, so I thought the intent of subordinate means it just has to be. It just has to be smaller, not
Right.
Yeah.
40% smaller.
Well, it's got to be small, and we were trying to determine how much small. That's what we were trying to put a.
But it does bring up a good point, the 60, I think, when you said the
thought support-
60% makes more sense because you still have
But,
the.
yeah,
overall
I guess
square
I thought
footage.
40% of an attached is like, you can't have. Majority of the house.
Right.
Be the accessory dwelling unit, so it's 40% of an attached one single floor plan structure.
Which I think makes sense, and that's our
Right.
current
Yeah,
rule. But
so I still think, now I'm just thinking the logic of how we word detached. That's
So are you?
much smaller.
And
It's
I'm
much smaller.
wondering whether we actually need to have a size limit on attached. Does that matter? Like, does it matter if they're 50-50? If you have a 1,000 square foot house that you split in half?
Well, we wanted, we definitely talked about that. We
I
wanted.
know we did,
Subordinate.
because we didn't
I
want to
think-
have
yeah.
a con or a,
Then it's
a duplex.
right.
or-
Then it's a duplex.
But that's where you get in the difference of what subordinate is, because if it's attached, then 50% is not subordinate.
Right,
But if it's detached, 50%
Is
is subordinate.
extremely subordinate.
Right.
Yeah, right.
That's what I'm saying. The
So fine, that's what I'm saying. So the-
calculations aren't the same.
Exactly. That's what that was your point. And I understood what you were, and
I'm just saying that.
right, I can see that, 60% for detached may make more sense or,
and it still has the upper limit of the 800 as somebody
right,
said earlier.
exactly,
Like it's-
exactly. Yeah.
Right, yeah, like if you had 1,000 square foot primary dwelling, like we're saying it's not okay to have an 800 foot detached. It's subordinate. But it's 800 feet, but it's way over 40%. So I'm just, so.
it's also
but
that
would be
not that
fine If
different.
they were touching each other, it would be fine, right? Because it would be much less than
touching.
what's 800 divided by 1,800? I don't know.
I'm gonna spill my water.
I gotta calculate,
Can I,
figure out the
So,
ratio.
yeah, Maddie, what do you got?
yeah, I just want to ask something else. If you have a non-conforming situation and they add on to that, for example, putting up this wall and it becomes more non-conforming or the non-conformation
no.
changes.
That's not what's going on.
But if that, so that won't happen. In this case, you can't become more non-conforming. It's the non-conforming still, it still exists under its current definition. It's just that we now are deciding basically what the size of the accessory if you want to change that use to a accessory dwelling unit, then how big can it be? Is that what we're
It's
saying?
not non-conforming. It doesn't
I thought
exist.
Lost. Non-conforming
existing,
things cannot be made worse.
but
Right.
that, yeah, existing,
But it's
so
not
that's
currently-
that's not what it is right now. That's
I thought we were. okay,
Right, well, 'cause-
that example. I'm lost.
I'm sorry, I was talking, and this
It's
just.
not
like-
currently what we're talking about. It's currently a garage with a kitchen in the back. So
We
it's
have
not one
a
of these
main
things yet.
dwelling at 800 and some square
Yeah.
feet. We have an accessory structure that is currently utilized as a commercial kitchen, catering kitchen type thing. So right
But it's
now,
totally
no
good.
nonconformities.
Yeah, it's
There is no- okay, I
conforming.
thought
It
I
is
thought
what it
was-
is currently, and it's conforming.
Okay, I see what
And
you're
then the idea of the wall movement is not increasing the footprint, the square footage of the footprint of that structure that we're talking about. It's just a question of moving it and
Yeah.
repurposing the internal space.
It's already all under roof at.
Yeah,
the
it's all already
500
under roof.
Some square feet, whatever that number was, so.
So it would come out to, Mayor, I said something close to 600 square feet if you did the math. 500 safe, right? So, I mean, it sounds like what we're shifting our thoughts on B there on the accessory dwelling detached and how much it can be and still be subordinate, right? That sounds like our thinking is shifting on that, right?
Right.
Yes.
And so things like we're still thinking 800 square feet is still a nice outer limit. But
That-
that the floor, like the house,
Yeah.
we can get compared
Let me
to.
put it this one more way. Okay. In a hypothetical house, let's use 2,000 square foot. There's a single family home, 2,000 square feet,
Single floor or?
Single floor?
single floor, single floor.
Okay.
A, accessory dwelling units attached. If you say you're gonna take 40% of that square footage, which is 800 square feet.
Mhm.
So 800 square feet. So you can have an accessory dwelling unit that is 800 square feet that's attached.
150.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, but you said, yeah,
Close to that.
okay.
Más o menos, yeah.
So that means that the primary dwelling is 1,200 square feet. I'm just using the number of 40%.
Right.
So the primary dwelling is 1,200 square feet. All right. So now take a 1,200 square foot house, a separate property now, they want to build a new detached accessory dwelling unit. Their primary dwelling is 1,200 square foot. Now take 40% of that. And that's,
300.
300.
yeah.
So right.
So that's what I'm saying. Like you have a 12, because it's detached, it has to be way smaller.
Right. And you know what, it's a math problem. What we're getting into is you have a total area on the first one when it's attached, but now that's detached, we're adding to that area, but we're not taking that into consideration on the 40%. You're no longer, if you're going to add, 800 square feet, it's no longer 2,000 square feet total, it's 2,800 square feet total. And what is 40% of that? So if we stick with the main house, it does make sense to bump that up percentage wise, but still keep your cap of, we have 800 now. I will also mention, we did in one of our packets had a letter from somebody asking for that to be 1,000 square feet, but I don't think we talked about accessory dwelling units at meeting. So just don't forget, there was at least one comment on that.
Yeah.
So we have to go back and make sure that we understand what gross means
Yes.
in those.
That's
two.
yeah. Sorry, it was a long discussion to get into. I think the numbers are calculated differently. If it's
Oh,
So part of this that's related to the size of the, whether it's an attached or detached is lot size and setbacks and
Yeah.
how much of your lot is actually covered by impervious building structure, whatever. So I don't know. I mean, there are other considerations too. And I mean, I wonder how much of a case by case basis it is. If you've got 1,200 square feet and you had 60% of that, it's what, 600-700 square feet. So then you have a 700 square feet. And you have to have a certain distance, I assume, between the house and the accessory dwelling unit. Have we talked about that distance?
No, but I believe it's either 5 feet or 10 feet per building code and or fire code requirements, because they need to have enough room to get in there, maneuver and scrub the side of a building.
It's like
I
a
can't
10
remember if
foot.
it's 5 or 10.
I think I would be okay moving it to 60%. I'm not sure that I would want to go up from 800 or 750 or whatever we ended up with.
And we're, again, Are we speaking of the accessory dwelling unit detached?
Yes.
And are we looking at with a property like the one we're talking about here with setbacks? We've got an existing building that wants to be turned into an accessory dwelling unit, and what if the setbacks aren't there already, or are they there? Because, in the old days, garages were put right up on the property line, which,
My presumption is nearby accessory structure is either on the property line or darn close to it.
Mhm.
So we do have to be careful on those non-conforming structures that already exist. So we already have them. And at first, when this was brought to us, I thought something was getting extended. So I got nervous that the thing that was going to be extended would be a an enlargement of the non-conformity, and you can't do that. But I think I now understand is that there's a part under roof that it has walls, houses the commercial kitchen, but there's a carport portion.
Right.
So I think you can reasonably consider that portion under roof is already sort of the thing that's there and has an impact.
right, so it's non-conforming as a garage, like you couldn't put a new garage there, like if that were, right? But now, so it's non-conforming as a garage. And can that just carry over to non-conforming vis-a-vis setbacks as an accessory dwelling unit detached?
We still have to get to that non-conforming
Okay.
section.
Okay.
But
And that's the part about bringing things
what
under
I think I've
code.
heard so
Yeah.
far is that generally speaking, that if the impact is already there,
Yeah.
then it's generally not a problem.
Right, okay.
Except
we have-
that the impact of a garage is very different from the
Right.
impact
Yeah.
of humans living next to the
True. and
property
We
line.
did even along those lines, you're correct, because we even increased some of our setbacks based on that exact thought.
That's right.
That the.
Yeah, we did talk about
Yeah,
that.
True.
And I gave the example of the house that's right next to me
Appreciate
that's
touching.
on, our, I mean, it is almost right on the property line. And,
Cool.
and it feels very tight.
We'll try to round that out a little bit more once we get to the portion where we're talking about the non-conforming structures and trying to figure out what to do. And I think it's gonna be really helpful for us to have the examples,
Yeah.
and we'll come up with photographs and other,
'Cause
things that are garages now and see how they
That's where the growth in this is gonna be, as opposed to new construction of,
likely.
I mean, that's definitely, so.
Yeah, and it helps that this is a CUP too, to take in
Right,
all these
case by
special
case.
considerations.
Yeah.
So should we kind of like, do we, I was just kind of pretending I was the chair again. What I mean, should we?
Go ahead, Pat. I thought we were gonna give a few minutes to John to talk about the,
I promise there won't be an opinion.
okay,
Yeah.
no,
About what?
Opining.
okay.
No.
John, why don't you go ahead and,
No, I just, it's obvious, and I think that we're going to, once we get a clean version, then we can see the connections much better. And we can, the term I use is future-proof this. By going through it and thinking of different scenarios, like Arnie's suggesting, we might have some examples. And I think between us all, if we came up with 4 or 5 or, a couple cases, we probably would cover a good number of the cases that we'd be facing. And just look at what happened with Mirabai's case coming forward. It made us re-examine. So to that point, we had the idea that, and I don't know how you all feel about it or how we could do it, is asking some architects or people that we know respond to code well here in Lexington to actually look this over, that we ask them to really give it a once through and kind of test it. And I think that would be helpful because some of these issues are design 3-dimensional issues, and we're talking about these as zoning. So, and then this handout, we don't have to go over it today, but it's an example of future proofing. Now that I found this was part of that slide packet that I asked Arnie to distribute to everyone. And I was looking at it today, and I think there's some clear language in here that relates to some of our clauses. And so we might edit our own clauses to some of these suggestions. And I'm not, given the time of day, I don't think we want to go through them now. But as we go over the newest version when Arnie gives it to us. We might come back and look at these examples.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. We'll discuss more in 2 weeks. How about we move on to other business? Zoning and planning report.
Building official and I conducted an inspection of 211 North Randolph Street. Could likely be approved for a short-term rental once the smoke alarms are installed. I have to admit, they didn't provide us with all of their paperwork so far for determining whether or not they are primary resident. But if they can meet that and install their smoke detectors, that would be number 34 for short-term rentals on our registration. Met earlier today with the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission about their interim data for the regional housing study. So they have some preliminary data out for us, and Jim and I spoke with Mel and with Olivia. Mel's not with the PDC, but Olivia is. And there may be some things that we can start before. I was under the presumption that we wouldn't be able to really start any measures until after we got the final study next year, or sometime about this time of the year. But we may actually be able to start something with Olivia as far as a housing survey and maybe some other grant opportunities before then. An electrician called, and he's working on the exterior lights at the Farmers Co-op that I think I mentioned previously do not currently meet the dark sky requirements. On your next agenda, lucky for you and for me, I guess, we are going to redo the lot width zoning text amendment public hearing. I got a little bit ahead of myself, and because there was an indication from the city manager that we go ahead and get that started sooner rather than later. I advertised for a public hearing for you guys. We held that public hearing, but then to do the paperwork for the initiation of the amendment, because there are 3 ways text amendments can be initiated. One's by the motion of the planning commission. One is by a resolution to initiate by council, and then some members of the public or property owners can also bring one in. So it was recommended from our attorney that since the initiation to amend the zoning ordinance from council was approved just at last Thursday's meeting, that we go back in order and hold the planning commission meeting for the public hearing for lot width requirements. Because
So didn't we already vote on it? What did we vote?
right, therefore it'd be so much easier this time. I'm hoping it was out of order. So
Okay.
initiate the amendment and then hold the public hearing for planning commission and then hold the city council's public hearing. So I got us out of order.
So whatever happened 2 weeks ago just is stricken from.
It is, except for your minutes.
Okay.
And it will be
Oh,
great
no.
to review those before that next meeting so that we can just fly through that.
Okay. No, I just was wondering, like, when we have a motion and it passes, but it just
It'll be the same thing again.
poof in the
It will
wind.
just-
Yeah.
Right. So that's my apologies
Okay.
for getting it out of order. Your next agenda will also likely include a request to amend your bylaws to delete the conflicts of interest section for city attorney. And so we'll be doing that. There's this 10-day notice requirement that we have to make sure that we can get through, and that's why it's not on your agenda this evening. That's all I got for a zoning report.
What are the requirements for passing that in terms of the vote?
Thank you for asking. The bylaws says amendments, subject to final approval of city council, these bylaws may be amended, repealed, or altered in whole or in part by a majority vote at any duly organized meeting of the commission. And this is the part that I didn't completely understand. Provided that notice and a description of the proposed change is submitted by the chairperson 10 days prior to the meeting at which the vote of the change is conducted. So the chair has to provide notice of the changes that are being proposed at least 10 days prior to your next meeting. So I will get the chair something tomorrow morning so that we are within the 10 days, and then we will provide that notice. Now, in our case, it doesn't say advertising, so it's not going to go in the paper. Those other instances when we have to notify or do a notice, we just put it on bulletin boards around City Hall, and that meets that requirement. So because of this slightly odd language, that I think you can interpret maybe in at least two different ways. We're going to make sure that we get a notice out from the chair at least 10 days prior to the next meeting.
And is there a place on the website that gets posted or can be posted?
It can be, it's not, we rarely do amendments to the bylaws, so I can't tell you what we've done before. But yes, it certainly can. And we already have the draft language and it's fairly simple as far as just repealing or deleting that section of our conflicts of interest section in the PC bylaws and just saying that all members must comply with the Virginia State and Local Government Conflict of Interest Act, and then gives the state code citation.
And the notice requirements are less than in a normal meeting
I
or
wish it would be more clear. It just says notice. It doesn't say advertisement, and it doesn't say notice in compliance with section 15.2-2204 of the state code, because that means an ad has to go the 2 weeks prior or for 2 consecutive weeks prior to the meeting. So it doesn't say that, it just says notice. And our interpretation is notice can be on bulletin boards around City Hall.
that's our bylaws that say what the notice has to be.
Great, thanks, Arnie. The next item is key annual PC milestones, including the zoning text amendments, comp plan review, and major project updates. Anything we can talk about?
Can I mention one on cottage housing?
Yeah.
Because it was brought up not long ago. Max Ivagov, who had some interest previously on cottage housing for the property that he had purchased at the corner of Walker and Houston Street. He came in the other day and obtained his demolition permit. So one, you're likely to see demolition of the existing building. There's a little bit of environmental remediation that needed to occur on the addition off the backside. That's happened, and he's now has his demolition permit. Asked him sort of what his time frame was, and he said something to the effect that he doesn't have a lot of bandwidth for it right now to bring forward text amendment for cottage housing. So I told him that we are planning roughly to have this in draft form by the middle of summer, maybe some public hearings, and then we would just naturally pick up with cottage housing after we're done with accessory dwelling units. And he seemed to be okay with that.
Sounds good.
How many units could he put on that?
I don't recall what the acreage is. I think it's less than an acre.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, cottage housing, you double the amount of units per acre, provided you meet all the other requirements in there. So I had to go back and take a look at, and
Wow.
if I remember correctly, his proposal, which hasn't been fully submitted because it wasn't complete, he had more than double the units on there.
Got it.
All right. Anything else in that section? Okay. City council report.
Yeah, City Council met last Thursday and we did unanimously approve the boundary line adjustments and boundary line vacations for those properties at Massey Street and Marble Lane. And you probably saw in the paper, but a Gold Star Memorial is going to go up at Jordan's Point Park. So just something else added to that.
That's confirms. I thought it was
As long
proposed.
as they raise the funds for it.
Okay.
Yeah. City Council
Where in
has
the
said,
park?
right now, it's as you pull in and there's that parking lot and pavilion to your right.
Mhm.
It'll be in that area somewhere.
It's being privately funded.
Yes, right. So it shouldn't interfere with anything else in the master plan.
And the Jordan Point plan,
Yeah.
Yeah. The Jordan Point master plan. Gotcha.
Yes,
Oh,
right, yeah,
sorry.
you're
Yeah.
right. The Jordan Point Park master plan, right?
Cool. Anything else? All right. Move to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Thank you.
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
All star families are families of people who died.